Good afternoon and welcome to the wig shop here in Colonial Williamsburg. My name is Debbie Turpin and I'm a journeyman wig maker here for the foundation. I've been with the foundation for almost 20 years now, the last 13 of which were spent here in the wig shop. My apprenticeship was completed in 2016 with the completion of a full wig from start to finish completely by myself. Our newest apprentice is Edith.
Hi y'all, I'm happy to be here with you today and to answer any questions you might have.
So in the 18th century, wig makers were technically three trades in one. We were wig makers, hairdressers, and barbers. For the wig making trade, which is predominantly what we're concentrating on, especially today, we are working with three different types of hair. We're working with human hair, originally coming from peasant girls from all over Northern Europe and Asia. We're working with horse hair from the mane of the horse in China. And we're working with goat hair from the Angora goat in Turkey. Not really working with a lot of local hair, primarily because of the climate. Let's be honest. Virginia in the summer in 2020 isn't much different than it was in 1776. Maybe we're a little warmer, a little more humid, but ultimately the humidity damages the hair over time. So everything imported, the human hair originally coming from girls that were selling their hair on the market. Girls raised from birth with the intention of selling their hair on the market between the ages of about 15 and 20 years old. These girls are coming from a long line of mothers and grandmothers who have been selling their hair from one generation to the next. And again, the horse hair and the goat hair also imported. If you're going to commit to the fashion of wearing wigs, we would definitely recommend the complete shaving of the head, especially for gentlemen, and that's who we're catering to. The reason we shave the head is to have your custom blockhead carved to your exact shape and size. We get that back, nail down the mesh base that you see here, and what I've been working on here. In this case, it's a hand knotted base made out of silk thread. It could also be cotton or linen, but every square of my netting is made from an individual knot put into the silk thread to create that netting. And I have a very small example of it here. Once that mesh base is nailed down, it's dampened so that it's going to shrink slightly. It's going to adhere to the shape of your head. Then the hair is woven, one row at a time, like Edith is doing to my left, to create those individual rows or wefts of hair. Those wefts are then stitched one at a time on the mesh to create the layers. Could be as few as 10 rows, might be as many as 80 to 100. The lighter the color, the more expensive the hair. The more hair involved, the more expensive the wig. So ultimately, it really comes down to what you're willing to spend to look good. The cost is a little prohibitive. A dark wig, such as this, would be your everyday fashion at an average cost of approximately £2, 3 shillings. For that same amount of money, about a month of a working skilled tradesman's wage, you can buy a half an acre of land on the outskirts of town. So what are you willing to spend your money on? If you choose to go that route and you're committed to the fashion, you're also going to own multiple wigs. Dark for everyday wear, gray for business for the gentleman, lends the aura of knowledge and prestige. White shows up best by candlelight. Portrait settings, balls and parties, military action. But just because we're generally catering to the top 5% doesn't mean that's the only person wearing our wigs. We'll put a wig on anyone as long as someone pays the bill. So you're going to find them on everyone from the royal governor to personal manservant and everyone in between. You'll find them on ship's captains, merchants, doctors, lawyers, professors, artisans, children, the convicted and the enslaved. As long as someone pays the bill, we don't really care who wears it. You're going to find them on personal manservants, butlers, footmen, coachmen. Anyone the public was likely to see on a regular basis is a representative of that household, such as the Randolphs or even the governor himself. So those individuals may be put in wigs as a symbol of the household. And again, we're also hairdressers. Everyone likes to talk and everyone asks us about George Washington. So let's go ahead and talk about him right off the bat. Washington has never worn a wig a day in his life. His own hair was dressed to the proper fashion, in his case, by his enslaved manservant William Lee, who then powders his hair for things like portrait settings, balls and parties, military action. And you can always go that route. We can use heated curling irons, such as this one, and on the brazier stove, hot embers placed inside the stove, iron set on top, so it's an indirect heat, hairpins and hairnets to hold everything together. But we can dress your hair to any number of elaborate fashions. Also barbers. Shaving basin held under the gentleman's chin will lather up the face and take the fringe right off for you. So we're here for all of your hair needs. It just comes down to what you're willing to spend to look good. And we'd love to answer any questions you may have for us, whether it's wig making, hairdressing, or barbering. I should also mention before I forget, there was a fourth aspect to the trade. In 1745, the barber used to be a barber surgeon. We could let blood, pull teeth, perform minor surgeries. We're no longer allowed to do that. You definitely have to go to the apothecary for such a service now.
Debbie and Edith, thank you so much for bringing us all into the shop today. You mentioned all the different folks that would wear wigs. In particular, would enslaved people or American Indians have occasion to wear wigs?
Yeah, we actually have a wonderful Runaway ad from 1752, if you could pull that up, please, and we can examine that. I personally love Runaway ads because they give a very detailed description of the individual, whether they were enslaved or an indentured servant, down to, in some instances, their stockings, their shoes, the material of their garments, and oftentimes the description of their hair, which in this case as one runaway ad with two individuals. And in the first description, it says that he took with him a brown wig. And in the second instance, there is a man who has his hair cut in an irregular manner. So we do know what the enslaved look like and are wearing. As far as the American Indian experience here in Williamsburg, I have not found documentation of those folks wearing wigs. So it seems to be the exception rather than the norm, really, because the grooming practices of American Indians are so vastly different than the European standards.
The question from Christian, who was curious if there were occasions when high-ranking officers, members of the gentry or nobility classes, there are occasions when they would not wear a wig specifically.
So the best example we have is definitely George Washington. He, of course, once the revolution breaks out as commanding officer, he's probably the most well known for not wearing a wig. I don't know of any personal officers of the military that would be versus wearing a wig versus not wearing their own hair. Edith's actually doing extensive research on that, as well as the enslaved and the indigenous here in the capital city in particular. But again, Washington's probably the most famous. Branching outside of Virginia slightly, even Benjamin Franklin was known to own wigs. He didn't much care for them, but there are portraits out there of him wearing wigs, so we know that he owned some at the very least. But Edith, do you know any specific officers in your research?
Yes, there's actually, I believe it's in the collections of Yale University, a man named Richard Alden. And this is only just because I've really been researching military hairstyles of the war. He is wearing his own hair. And I find that if we go and look at portraiture often and frequently, we're going to find a vast experience of whether you're wearing, if the individual preferred to wear wigs or if they chose to wear their own hair. So I think it's a toss-up, honestly.
We know that military wigs are being worn, the Hessian soldiers, for instance, the hair bound and wrapped from the nape of the neck down to the tail of the wig or the queue. So we know that military fashions or military officers are definitely wearing wigs, typically in gray. Again, gray is sort of that color of business wear, so it's a mark of a learned professional. But again, the best example is Washington not wearing a wig, the most famous probably.
And there is quite a lot written on military protocol with how enlisted men and officers are to dress their own hair. In fact, I believe Cuthbertson, sorry about that, wrote about soldiers queuing their hair, which is where it's tied in the back, and it could be a braided queue, et cetera, but they would wrap it with 3/4 an inch black ribbon. So there are military hygienic practices in place at this time for their own hair. Sorry.
We've got a question from Carolyn. I mean, we've talked about men in particular. Would women wear wigs in everyday situations? And then following up on that, Susie was also curious, you mentioned shaving of the head. Would women's heads be shaved prior to wearing wigs?
So we find that it's the exception rather than the norm for women to fully commit to the fashion of shaving their heads. That's to say it hasn't happened or didn't happen at all. As far as here in Williamsburg, I haven't found any evidence for women who were in the practice of shaving their heads. That being said, we do offer a variety of attachments for women to definitely achieve the fashionable hair of the mid-1770s. So definitely I think a lot of us are familiar with those very tall hairstyles that we often associate with Marie Antoinette. So we would add false attachments to that in the form of, it can be curls, it can be buckles, which we also refer to as curls, braids, buns. We have the ability to do that as hairdressers and wig makers.
Doug, following on the idea that people in different lines of work might have different styles of wigs, was curious if those men would always wear the style of wig identified with their trade or profession, or if outside of a business context they would wear something different.
That's a great question. Think of wigs as a fashion accessory. So think of them like pairs of shoes. That's one of the best equivalents I've been able to find for the modern time. You've got different pairs of shoes for different occasions, seasons, weather conditions. So think of wigs along those same lines. Your dark wigs are your everyday fashion. That's what you're going to wear day in and day out. That's like your modern day pair of sneakers. Then the gray lends the aura of knowledge and prestige for business wear. So like a good business suit. And then white shows up best by candlelight. This particular wig is actually for a clergyman. The flat section, it's called a closed tonsure. If you think of the monk that shaves the top of their head, that's called an open tonsure to symbolize there's nothing between them and their God. This symbolizes humility before God. So in very specific cases, like the clergyman or like the barrister or solicitor, the wig is very specific to the position or to their profession. But dark in general is kind of that everyday color, that day in and day out color. So imagine, especially for a gentleman, you start your day in a dark wig. You get to your place of business. You switch to your gray wig. Once the business day is over, you switch to your dark wig to return home. And then if you're going out for an evening out on the town or a ball or a party at the governor's palace, then you switch to a white or a pale wig, perhaps like this one back here that has the bag on it. So the bag dresses the wig up for that more formal look, and white's going to show up best by candlelight. So you would definitely have different wigs for different occasions, seasons, and even weather conditions. That's a great question.
Following that long list of wigs, how would people store all of these things? And then Wendy was curious about caring for a wig. How are people typically caring for them?
So you can see on the table here, we have some blockheads, and then we just have a stand over here. And you can see the different progressions. So storing wigs, if you were a dedicated wig wearer, you often would have blockheads for your own personal use, as well as some that would be stored at the wig maker if you're bringing them in frequently. So people did wash their wigs with Castile soap. It's an olive oil based soap, so it's going to be softer on the hair follicles than, say, a harsher soap as a complete lye would, or a lye soap would be. And normally you could pay what we would think of as a subscription. It could be a yearly subscription. We have records of up to 2 years for washing and dressing of a wig here at the shop that we represent, which was Edward Charlton. So you would just drop your wig off, we'd wash it, we'd restyle it to the latest fashion, or if you had a dedicated style that you preferred, we'd redo that and you'd be able to pick it up. Otherwise, we do have records of Dr. John Sequeira here in Williamsburg, who had his enslaved manservant Bob trained in barbering and I believe in the care of wigs as well. So you could have an individual within your household who is trained in that once you have the completed wig from the wig maker. So you could perform that upkeep at home if someone is skilled and trained in it.
Following on taking care of things, Christy brings up the always pleasant topic of lice. Would wigs get lice in them, and if so, what do we do?
So it's a head of hair. So lice is definitely a problem. The biggest thing about lice is that they don't care if you're wearing your own hair or a wig. But by the 1770s, it's not necessarily an everyday issue anymore. We have an outbreak and we deal with it. Knit combs used to comb through the hair, very much like the modern ones that you would find today on the market. The oil of lavender rinsed through the hair is known to work. Sulfur mixed with beeswax and whale blubber. So we do have recipes. We have remedies to take care of lice if it's a problem. In the case of the wig, the convenience for the wig wearer is that the wig can be brought back to us and we can delouse it. But you have to treat the body or it's not really going to do us a lot of good to treat the hair. The reason that we shave the head, to kind of go back to that a little bit, is to achieve that good proper fit. But that shaving will also help to minimize the problem of lice. But lice is certainly a problem, but we have an outbreak, we deal with it. It's not necessarily an everyday problem, especially for our wig wearers. If you're bringing your wigs back on a regular enough basis, then it wouldn't have been a problem for the most part.
And I'd like to add that there are texts from the period, such as The Complete Housewife, and numerous ladies' magazines. Who is it? It's by, I believe, James Stewart, the text. That there are remedies and receipts for delousing oneself or even fumigating your home, such as in The Complete Housewife, if you have a vermin problem. It's a little before our time, but Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary in London in the late 17th century that he went to pick up his wig from the Wigmaker and it was full of lice. So it's a thing, but by the time that we arrive to the latter half of the 18th century, we've developed some methods to kind of keep it under control.
What about just hair hygiene in general? How do people keep their hair clean in 18th century England, or excuse me, in 18th century Williamsburg? And then with our weather here, how do they deal with high humidity? We tend to fuss about that quite a bit today.
It hasn't changed, honestly. I have my hair dressed today with powder and pomatum, and those are the two styling agents that we use during the period. The pomatum is actually made with the receipt that we have, which is coming from La Toilette de Flora. It's made out of leaf lard, which is the fat surrounding a pig's kidneys. And it's rendered and soaked for about 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on, how pungent it is. And you're changing the water every day when you're processing this pomatum, so you aren't going to smell like lard. You can mix it with tallow that's been soaked in the same process as well. There's different degrees of pomatum. There's hard pomatum, which is going to give you more of a lift with your hair. So with those high humidity days, you're going to want to use the hard pomatum. Soft pomatum is, it just depends on the sculptural look that you're trying to achieve with the hair. And the pomatums are oftentimes scented. We don't use lavender in our shop, just because personal preference, but you can do cinnamon, you can do cloves, you can do jasmine. Rose was popular during the period. So you're applying the pomatum liberally through your hair, much as we would use a mousse today. As far as the powder, there are different receipts for those as well. You can use a very fine wheat starch. You can use bean flour, so grind up beans and make your own hair powder. I haven't tried that yet, honestly. It's not for lack of wanting to, I just haven't had the time. You could also use ground up beef bones, which once again, I am not quite that adventurous, but it's on the bucket list of hair to do. The closest equivalent today, which I personally use, is going to be arrowroot starch or something similar to a cornstarch, because it needs to be light. You don't want to use a heavy powder on your head. So once again, we can do plain white powders. We can do Marichal powders, which are tinted brown. We can do the fantasy shades. Lane, would you mind pulling that up? Thank you. So this is an example of pink hair powder, and personally, I love this look. We have examples of blue hair powder as well. It's tinted with different pigments, which is so much fun. So we oftentimes think of powdered wigs as stuffy old men wearing them, but it's a fashionable accessory. And if the powder falls on your shoulders, it's not seen as a big deal in the 18th century. Would you mind pulling that image up too? Of on his
The powder
collar.
on the collar.
Yeah. We might not have it, but it's
On
okay.
his shoulders.
On the collar of his coat. It might be the French guy.
Here's the French guy.
Yeah, let's do the French guy.
Here's the French guy.
All right. So as we can see on the collar of this gentleman's coat, he's got some hair powder on it, and it's accepted. It's not something that was really fussed over.
You can also see in several portraits, if you look closely enough and you know what you're looking for, you can actually see where the powder is on the forehead. So in the case of a wig, it's often powdered and then placed to the head in something like the powdering basket that we have back here. But in the case of a natural head of hair like Washington, when he has his hair powdered, it may actually be portrayed in the portrait itself. As we sometimes say here in the shop, there's nothing new with Photoshop. In the 18th century, it was the artist's brush. So you could literally sit down with your own natural hair color, and it could be powdered white because portraits were formal events. It was often portrayed whether you actually sat down with powdered hair or not.
I hope that answered your question. Sorry.
Sorry. Charlotte had a question about colored powders. Would those have been made by Wigmakers, or are those things that you've purchased?
You could purchase those at perfumers. You could purchase some ingredients at apothecaries. I'm actually not too sure, Charlotte. Good question. I'll have to look into that and get back to you if they were produced on site. I know that we have receipt of Washington here in town purchasing, was it 3 pounds or 10 pounds of hair powder from George Lafong, who was one of the 8 wig makers active during the period we portray.
But he's a competitor. We don't talk about him very much.
I mean, we can. He's French.
Speaking of which, Wendy was curious, who were wig makers? Was it mostly men or mostly women or a mix of the two?
It's definitely a male-dominated trade. Our shop today is very female-dominated, so we get that question quite a lot. A lot of folks come in with the assumption that it is a female-dominated trade. With very few exception, they are all men. Of the approximately 80 wig makers that came and went during the time of the 18th century, the entire period, every single one of them was a man. We know that ladies or females were working within the trade. A couple of examples are Abigail Peake. Abigail Peake was actually, her husband was a wig maker down in Yorktown. She ran his business in his absence. He often went to England or whatever travels he may be conducting. Abigail Peake would actually run the shop in his stead. She was an apprentice of his to begin with and then ended up marrying him. Upon his death, she actually, unfortunately, had to sell the business to pay off all of his debts. But she's the closest we've come to an actual female wig shop owner. Another example is Mary Murray. If you're familiar with the shop and you've been here before, you know that Betty Myers, the master of our shop, is in the past portrayed Mary Murray on occasion. And she was an apprentice to Edward Charlton, the wig maker that we talk about today. The closest that I've come across, and I would love to get my hands on more detail of the inventory, is Elizabeth Chamberlain in Norfolk. When upon her death, an inventory of her estate was taken, which says a lot. It was her estate, not her husband's, not the master of the shop or anything like that. 12 shaving basins were found on her inventory. So at the very least, we suspect that she was some sort of barberess, if not more than that. But it is a very male-dominated trade. And again, if you're familiar with the area, you've been to visit us in the past, we talk about Edward Charlton. I've been to the coffee house just up the street. That's Richard Charlton. So they're brothers and competitors at one point. I guess Richard just found better business in the coffee house part of his business as opposed to the wig making business. But 100% definitely a male-dominated trade.
I would like to add that oftentimes women were contracted out as day laborers for weaving. This is considered unskilled labor, and a proficient weaver could weave about an inch per minute. I'm not there yet.
I haven't timed myself, so I don't know if I can do that either.
Thank you. Debbie, Brian and Linda were asking about the process of making the base of the knitting that you're doing right now. If you could speak to that a little bit, some of the how-to on that.
Of the approximately 24 wigs that I've been able to study from the time period, the extant wigs, I'd say a good 98% of them are this hand knotted silk base. We have found examples of linen, which is what I used for the completion of my journeyman project, was a linen thread as opposed to silk thread. But each one of these knots, and Lane, I think we've got a short video if you can play that. Each one of the knots is an individual knot put into the thread to create the netting. So it comes with just the shuttle and the gauge. The gauge is ultimately what's going to determine the size of those holes. It can be much larger. This is the smallest we've found and seems to be pretty accurate to the originals that we've been able to study. So in this case, it's a bamboo knitting needle that we've incorporated today. But the thread is wrapped around the gauge to determine the actual size. And then the thread is just wrapped around your shuttle, and that's going in and out. The closest equivalent I've come, and I admit I'm not proficient in the practice, but the closest I've come is tatting. We have spoken a little bit about, or spoken to someone at CDC who does a little bit of tatting, or quite a bit of tatting, so to try to figure out what the differences are. Until I sit down and practice tatting, I'm not going to be able to tell you what those differences are right now. But this creates the undercarriage, or that base to the wig, and because it is a custom fit, we want it to be as secure as possible. The advantage to the hand knotted netting is I can literally take a pair of scissors, I can cut this netting anywhere I have to. I've already got mistakes I'm going to have to take out on this one. So I can cut it, and because it's knotted and not woven fabric, it's not going to unravel on me. The disadvantage is that it's time consuming. This base, just for example, took me 75 hours to create. I've gotten much faster at it. But this base alone took me about 75 hours. And a wig, 18th century is going to, well, for us today in the 21st century, it takes about 150 to 200 hours worth of labor. 18th century, that's about 2 or 3 days working sun up to sundown, depending on how many people are working on it. So this base would probably, for the most part, be imported as opposed to being made on site. I haven't found any references to 18th century wig makers within the colonies practicing the trade. It's actually a technique that had to be taught to us from a lady that came down to help us with this reproduction, actually. So this is a hand knotted base inside. So she came to help us with this reproduction piece, and then it's been passed on to me and the mistress of the shop. So right now that silk base is ultimately what's holding that wig to your head, and it's individual knotted thread. That's a great question.
Thanks. We've talked about men and women, but Erin is wondering about children. Would children ever wear wigs?
We do find some reference to children wearing wigs, especially of the upper crust of society, the royalty in particular. Locally, we found reference to Petey, Mr. Anderson's, the blacksmith's son, a wig being purchased for him, very small in size. Children's wigs are going to be identical to adult wigs, just on a much smaller scale. But they are definitely being worn, but it's, in his case with the blacksmith, it's probably in a case of he's showing Mr. Anderson is showing off his station society, showing he's a very well-to-do blacksmith, that he's a successful business, so he's able to afford to put his son in a wig to kind of show off his station. There are some references. We've heard boys as young as 7, girls as young as 10. And then in England, boys as young as 5 and girls as young as 7. But much like ladies, we're not finding a lot of reference to it here within Williamsburg.
Time for one last question. You mentioned earlier studying extant wigs. Could you tell us more about surviving wigs from the period? Where are they? How often are you able to look at them? What can you learn from them?
Absolutely. So when we go to, unfortunately, we're one of those trades that doesn't have a lot on hand. We can't, for the most part, go to any other local museum to find extant wigs. For us, as they were in the 18th century, they're articles of clothing. So what do you do with an article of clothing that started to go out of fashion? Do you pass it down? Do you throw it away? Do you replace it? So a lot of our wigs, we actually have to travel abroad. So it's one of those, unfortunate, fortunate things. We have to travel abroad. Oh darn, we have to go all the way to England to study that wig. But we have to rely very heavily on donor funds for that as well. So I have been able to study with Betty, the master of the shop. I have been able to study about 24 wigs over the years since I started. The vast majority of them are in England, Germany. There are some in France, Switzerland, and Sweden. My favorite wig, if I can throw that out there, is actually in the National Museum in Denmark. It's a glass fiber wig. So as I said, the 3 types of hair: human, horse, and goat. But they're also made out of things like copper wire and spun glass. We're hoping, fingers crossed, to see if we can find someone that we can work on that hand spun wig and see if we can get that recreated somehow. But what we're learning from them is those techniques. When Betty started, way back when, she's been here for a while, the wigs were, because we didn't have anything local, she had to travel abroad. She had to study them herself. She did a lot of the techniques from guesswork, and then she was able to confirm or deny that sort of guesswork by visiting abroad. So we're looking for basic things. What is the undercarriage made out of? What type of hair is it? What's the style? Who was wearing it? How much would it have cost? We're looking for inventories as well. So again, we're relying pretty heavily on donation for that so that we can travel abroad. Our hope, obviously, is to get Edith to study. She hasn't been able to study an original piece yet, so we're working on getting towards that, hopefully.
Sans COVID.
Sans COVID.
Debbie and Edith, thank you both so much for taking the time to invite us all into your shop and share with us your knowledge and skills in the trade. We also thank all of you watching at home for your great comments and questions and your support. We're also grateful to both the Sotheby's Auction House and the Royal Collection Trust for sharing permissions to use some of their images today.
Absolutely.
All of our programs are made possible by the generosity of our donors. To learn how you can support presentations like this, please follow the link pinned to the comments below or visit us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Debbie and Edith, do you have any final thoughts to share with folks before we say goodbye?
Thanks for spending time with us today. It's been a lot of fun. And thank you to our donors. We cannot do this without you. So your support is invaluable and it helps us be better hair historians. Sorry.
Absolutely. Right now, of course, our shop is just too small to accommodate guests on a daily basis. So right now we are working. Tomorrow, Thursday, we'll be at the gallery. And then starting next week, we're going to be in there on Wednesdays. So please try to stop by if you're in town to see us there. We will be actively working on as much as we can in a more modern setting. But we look forward to seeing you all when we're able to get people back into the shop. Thanks.
Thank you.